We'll be starting in 2 more minutes, just hanging out till the official time rolls around. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to be speaking about driven game development. This is a topic that I really enjoy. It's something that I've done for a while, and it's something that I think about a lot and work on throughout my daily process. So I am Nick Klingensmith. I work for Microsoft. I'm on the Mixed Reality Academy team, where I do a lot of different things. I'm kind of part evangelist. I'm part developer. I do a lot of technical content and tutorials, and of course, tools for mixed reality developers. So my current project, which is kind of interest here, is a mixed reality library called StereoKit. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about this throughout the presentation. But StereoKit is just a library for doing mixed reality applications without going through a whole pile of different compile steps or build processes. It's kind of like what I imagine the ultimate tool to be for mixed reality development. But it's been a long road for me to get to this particular point. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my past experiences with game development and using a tool-driven workflow to build a lot of different projects. So I first got my start in the game industry doing game development when I was 12. Morrowind in particular was a huge inspiration for me early on. I saw this and I played through it and I fell in love with it. And it was such an incredible experience to me. I still come back to it and use it as reference and inspiration. But my whole career has been characterized by this idea of I would like to make something like Morrowind, but I've rarely had the team or resources to do this in a group or with funds. And so it's something that I have to say, how do I do this myself? And my answer to this has been to create good tools that allow me to do this type of thing. So I first started, since I started so early, I didn't really have access to things like Unity or Unreal, like these magnificent game engines that are super easy to get started with. When I started, you had to write it from scratch. And so this is what I did through my teenage years. I built game engines based on DirectX or XNA. I spent a lot of time doing a lot of different things, experimenting with how to build stuff. And I created some really cool stuff. It wasn't until till I got to college where I sat back and looked at what I had done and said, wow, I've created such a body of work, but none of these are actually games. I should sit back and maybe do some game development instead. So And I'm going to skip around a little bit here because my career is a little weird and wandery, but I spent a lot of time after and during university in professional game development. I worked a lot in indie mobile as well as social mobile. And more recently, I've worked a lot in VR games as well. So a lot of my experience has basically been, how do I create games for these kind of more constrained platforms like mobile phones or VR-based phones, phone-based VR, where like you've got a phone GPU and you're trying to render stereo at these really high resolutions at really high frame rates. And so a lot of my work has been, how do I extract the most performance out of these platforms? What sort of build pipelines or art can I use that looks nice and still performs really well? And then in between a lot of these different things at some of these companies that I worked with, as well as some of my own ventures as an independent developer, have been in creating these tools that I've talked about. So my biggest success is Fair2D here, which is up on the Unity Asset Store and is designed for creating environments for two-dimensional platforming games, but it definitely doesn't stop there. I've worked on all sorts of different things. A lot of what I like to do is kind of like procedural geometry, level design, and things like that. So I have a huge collection of tools that I've built for myself as well as for other people. And a lot of what tools are at their core is effort amplification. Like, how do you take the work from one person and amplify that to be more impactful, to create more with that effort? How do you do more with your tools? And this goes back again to Morrowind. You know, like if I'm going to be doing this solo or in a small group, I have to be able to create a large amount of content either quickly or with little effort. So all of my tools are, how do I take myself and make my output greater than just what I put into it? So my first test here came from my own company. It was me and a business partner, and we had a whole pile of different people working with us. And one of our bigger projects was this 100 games project. We built 100 games over the course of 5 months, and this is absolutely bonkers. You know, like we spent a lot of time just like, gotta crank out another one. We had a deadline of 20 per month, and we hit every single deadline on the nail with very little room to spare, but we did go through it and we did manage to do it. My particular role in this project was mostly as the, I would help people with their development. I would polish off the final product, make sure it was smooth around the edges. I would go through a lot of the publishing. But I also spent a lot of time building tools and templates for each of my developers. So I would sit down and I would say, like, okay, here's a template for a game. And then I would make it nice, easy to adjust, and I would hand it off to people, and they could then use that template to change, adjust, make variations on the gameplay or extend that gameplay into something a little bit more interesting. And also tools. We did a lot of tools for social promotion sort of things, or even gameplay mechanics, where it was like, here's a module you can use for this chunk of gameplay or that chunk of gameplay, and they could slot that into a project that they were doing. So this was actually one of the bigger pieces of success for this project. One of the things that really enabled it to pull through and deliver on those 20 games every single month, because people were able to take those pieces and actually create really quickly. Like, most of the people on my team could create a game in a week or two based off of this platform of tools. The other thing is, this is an example from StereoKit, where I basically took the StereoKit library itself and created a small painting application that was, you could save, you could load, you could paint, you could do a couple of things. It's relatively basic, but the core of this is actually like I don't know, 300 lines of code. It's a very small application. When you do have the right tools, these tools can allow you to do quite a lot of functionality with very little code or very little work. So this is just an example of like what a good tool would be able to do with very little. Like just taking these small little pieces and making more with them. Okay, so smart tools. One category of tool that I think is really interesting and is something that we're being introduced to in the last couple of years and as we go forward are these really smart tools. They're not just tools that do what you ask them to. They're tools that maybe do a little bit more than that, either through these algorithms that do something procedural in the background or something based on artificial intelligence. So these are a couple of ones that come to mind right away, especially from the procedural side of things. Like these are all tools that, like, honestly, the amount of actual art that you end up doing is much more code than art. It depends on which ones, of course. Houdini is very much kind of like a programmer's art tool where you're doing a lot of these nodes. But something like Substance Painter might involve kind of a mix of these things. But these are very smart tools that do a lot for you, usually through algorithms. Then there's also artificial intelligence. If you've been paying attention to what's happening in the machine learning side of things, like artificial intelligence is getting super smart. This is the first one that really caught my attention. It was a little bit older at this point, but right now, artificial intelligence is creating all sorts of wild and crazy things through, like, I've even seen 3D models, but I've also seen like paintings and videos that are generated using similar techniques to what you see right here. But artificial intelligence is something that's creeping into a lot of different applications. I've seen it in painting tools where Clip Studio Paint will actually colorize your line art for you based off of its best guess, or stuff like that. So this is a good category of things to watch out for. I don't know of a whole lot that I would sit down and say like, yeah, you should use this today. There's probably a few out there that I haven't seen, but this is something that you do want to watch out for in the near future and just be aware of, because these things will really revolutionize your workflow once you get a hold of them. From my own side, I've been working on a tool called Fabrica, and this is kind of similar to that Houdini direction of things, where it's something that's very procedural. A lot of these algorithms sitting in the background doing the work for you. And a lot of what this is focusing on the user interface, the user experience, and trying to bring this up to a higher level of abstraction instead of being just programming with wire nodes, which is the root of Fabrica, but then taking these complex graphs and then surfacing them into something very simple to interact with that isn't necessarily at this level of programming something. So always keep in mind, like, what sort of tools am I looking at? Like, is this a smart tool? Is this something that actually amplifies it? Or is it just something that's like efficiently doing what I tell it to? The best tools, I like to think in terms of fluency of an abstraction when measuring a tool. Like, fluency is something that's very important for creating good content. If you are fluent with something, like if you are a fluent English speaker, then you can speak English without having to think about it. Like, my favorite example of fluency is the car. Like, there are occasions where I'll drive to work and I won't even notice that I've done it. Like, there was actually one occasion on a weekend where I got in my car and the next thing I knew, I was at work, even though it was a weekend. Like, I had just zoned out and ended up at work because I was so fluent with the vehicle. I was so fluent with that route. I could do it without thinking about it. My mind was free to like wander and do other things. And this is honestly the state that you want to be in when you're creating content. You never want to be thinking like, what is the hotkey? Like, how do I do this particular thing? Like, those things should be gone and done. They're totally irrelevant. If you are thinking about those things, you are not thinking about creating. You're problem solving, not being creative. And the same kind of thing with abstraction. When you bring things up to a higher level of thought, you can think about them easier. You don't have to get mired in the details. So one of the things that I often tell people who are trying to create something or be creative is honestly, like, start on paper. Paper is one thing that we're all fluent with. We can all just sit down right away and start creating something on that piece of paper. It's a great place to start. If you are not familiar with Blender, your 3D modeling tool, or your level design tools, then you always want to be creative on paper first and then translate it into your tool, where you may need to spend some time to look things up. But you can create and ideate without that technical barrier between you and that process. Another good example of something that is related to fluency is kind of the overhead in learning these applications. So at this point, I've been using Photoshop for, goodness, as long as I've been programming, 18, 19 years. I have a lot of familiarity with Photoshop, and I can do a lot of things in my sleep. But every time they make an update, there's new features, or sometimes there's menus that I'm not familiar with. And there's a lot of learning overhead that may go into certain pieces here where I lose a little bit of fluency, or it's just, for somebody who's new to Photoshop, it may be very difficult to gain that fluency to begin with. But something on the top right here, you see Procreate on the iPad. This is a very simple application. There's not a lot of buttons. It's like you can learn it in an hour. Like, you just go through, you click on everything. You have a very good understanding of how this works. So it is much easier to be fluent in Procreate than it is to be fluent in Photoshop. So this is something to also think about. There's a lot of different applications in between these things. I really love Blender, but Blender is notorious for having a very steep learning curve. The nice thing about Blender, though, is that once you pass this learning curve, you do gain fluency and retain it throughout the experience, and it can be very quick to be productive. But always think about, how easy is it to become fluent? How much of an investment will I have to make in order to become fluent in this tool? And this is something that I have another good example of in StereoKit. StereoKit is a code-first application. So it is a complicated thing to learn and interact with. Like, a code API is definitely not trivial. But you can design your code API in such a way that it's not all that difficult to build something. This in particular is an example of building a user interface. I've always been frustrated in a lot of game engines or tools about how complicated it is to build a user interface. But you can see on the code over here, this is all the code required in order to create that menu right there. Like, that's the whole chunk of code that you have to write. And that's relatively easy to learn. Like, it's all pretty self-explanatory, but it's also very simple once you've done it before. Like, you should be able to do this pretty easily again, just keeping it really basic. But again, along with this, it's still a little tricky to learn. So another thing to consider with your tools is, what is the documentation like? So StereoKit, I've built in documentation as a first-class citizen. Anytime that I write code inside of StereoKit, I actually add little meta tags as well as comments, and these all get scraped. Screenshots get generated during my testing process, and this all gets built into a web page like this one over here. So this is all automatically done. It's easy for me to maintain, and this documentation is guaranteed to work. It's guaranteed to be up to date, and the screenshots are guaranteed to be relevant, which means that the documentation is then of pretty high quality and is always up to date. And this is a very tricky thing, right? Like, one of the reasons why I still often recommend Unity to people is because there's so much good documentation about it. This is absolutely a factor that you should use when considering your tools. Like, how much documentation is out there? How many people in the community support it? If I have a problem with it, how easy will it be to resolve? Because again, if you are trying to ideate or create something, you don't want to be bogged down with, how do I do this? How do I fix this? Why is this not working? So documentation is key. Always consider this when choosing or creating your tools. Another thing is iteration time. This is something that I find super important to my processes, and I think most people should, even if it may be difficult to acquire at times. So iteration time allows you to build something, evaluate it, and then do it over again. So I've had a couple of experiences here that really underscored how this works. The first one that I did at Microsoft was this little mind mapping software based on a multi-user experience where you could take a phone and a HoloLens, you could get in the HoloLens and do your mind mapping, and somebody could come with a phone, link up to that experience and walk around and look at it and interact with it as well. And the trouble with this particular application was that in order to build the iOS build of this, as well as the HoloLens build, it took about 2 hours to just completely go through that whole build pipeline. So anytime that I wanted to try something or iterate on a feature, especially since this is mixed reality, where the interaction paradigms are very different and still mostly experimental, I had to wait 2 hours every time I wanted to try something out. And this was mind-numbingly difficult because, 2 hours is not just 2 hours. You kick off these builds because this is 2 completely separate computers, one for Windows, one for iOS. Like I had to fragment my build process into multiple different steps spaced across those 2 hours. I was, maybe I'd go on Twitter during that or read some articles or get in a book or do something else entirely. So that turns into 3 hours or 4 hours or whatever. You get 2 builds in a day. I don't know. It was nuts. And so I promised myself that I would never do that type of iteration process again. And basically not iterate on device. So the next project that I did at Microsoft was the mixed reality lighting tools, where I built a tool for myself for exposing all of these mixed reality inputs to my laptop. So one thing in particular that I really needed access to for this one was the gyroscope, because a lot of this is about like rotating your camera, which direction is the camera facing. And so Unity does have access to a gyroscope, but it only has it in full builds. So you can't get access to it from within the editor. So that would mean I would have to wait for a full build anytime I wanted access to that gyroscope. So I built this tool. It went to the sensor APIs for the computer directly and pulled it straight into the Unity editor. It only worked in editor. It was only relevant for the editor. And I spent a bunch of time trying to build this up. But once I built it, my ability to then look at my process in the editor, debug it right then and there, or tweak things in the inspector was incredibly powerful. Like, first of all, it was a lot more fun because I didn't have to wait. But second of all, it allowed me to play with these things and iterate on very small details right away. And this made a world of difference in the quality of the final product because I could actually tweak these small little details as much as I wanted to until it felt perfect. So always think about iteration time in your tools as well. Like, how do I make sure my iteration time is as fast as it can be? Because this is a really big difference between a product that is painful and unpleasant to work with and a product that is actually quality and has this attention to detail. This is something I also did with StereoKit too. I managed to pull the build time, like a full build time, under a minute. which is a world of difference from like the 15 to 20 minutes that I was seeing before in ideal cases. Okay, so once you have these tools, or when you're thinking about doing your own development, this is kind of the process that I follow when building my own stuff. Is basically to build the tools or learn the tools that I need to do, that I need to use for the job. So after I did a couple of years at Zynga, I quit and I spent a year doing my own thing. The idea that I left with was this idea that I would create 52 games in a year, one a week. And I started doing this by building a library of tools. That's not what I want. Yeah, so by building a library of tools. And so I built a couple of gameplay tools and game state management tools that would really allow me to create the type of games that I was interested in much faster. Like I built a skill tree, I built a game state management tool, I built a whole pile of weapon modules and enemy spawning modules, because I really love action and stuff like that, like really quick shooty sort of things. And this was actually great. It took me like a month or two to polish a lot of these things off. And this was the first game that I made during that process. This ended up taking me 2 weeks instead of one. But I basically had the core game loop done in the first 2 days because I had all the right tools available for me. So like 2 days and I had the core game right there and ready. Like it looked good. It played nicely. And then the part where I actually got bit, and the reason why this took 2 weeks instead of just like a couple of days, was that I didn't have any tools for a user interface. Because I had a skill tree and a lot of level selection stuff, my user interface ended up being at least a little bit complicated, but I was stuck with Unity's default tools, which if you've ever done user interface in Unity, you might know that Unity's UI tools are not great. So I ended up spending all of my time on user interface, and I really should have probably invested some time in building up a small user interface library for me to do these things a little bit easier. Similarly, the second game that I built, and you can see this is a very different type of game. This is in fact in VR, but all the core tools are essentially the same sort of ideas. Like it's shooting, it's spawning, and like a little bit of these gameplay unlock trees. But this also took about 2 or 3 days to get it working. I never actually finished this one. I burned myself out really fast. I don't think I recommend 52 games in a year if you are the type of person that cares about quality. Like it just doesn't happen quite that fast. Maybe half that or a third of that, and give that a try instead. 2 or 3 weeks is maybe a little more reasonable. But you know, like I could still get the core loops done in a couple of days, and I'd be able to play the game right away and then iterate on the feel and experience of it. Another one, and this is actually a completely different game, not part of that series. Yeah, so this was a VR exploration and crafting game that I built. And this one I spent about 2 or 3 months on before I had to stop for certain reasons. But this was more a product of just choosing the right tools and building with those. So like I'm super fluid with Blender at this point. I've also been using that for a long time. So everything here is modeled in Blender. I can kick out these models in like 20 minutes or less. I was using Procreate for my texturing, and that process was working super well for me. This was also Unity 5.4, I believe. So this was when Unity was super stable. like I knew it inside and out. They didn't have any of these preview packages or anything like that. Like I was just able to churn out content for this game in particular. I had just learned my tools so well that all the tools that I was just using already were the perfect tools for the job. So honestly, sometimes you don't need to create your own tools. You can just gain a high level of fluency with the tools that are already out there and available for you. Another place to look for tools is something like the asset store. That's my shortcut overlaps there. But the asset store is, there's so many man hours of work gone into these things, and you can find some editor extensions that really just are absolute steals for the price that they're charging. Like there's so much stuff up here that you can just like buy it for $30, install it into your project, and just completely bypass a year's worth of work. So definitely look to the asset store, either the Unity asset store or the Unreal Marketplace or wherever it is that you might be working in. These are super valuable resources. And while it may be a little bit of a landmine sometimes, not every product is created equal, it's still worth hunting for something that's really good, because they're definitely out there. And we're getting towards the end here. So I starting to think a little bit more forward here. The Unreal Engine just showed a preview of their Unreal Engine 5. And like a lot of people, when they looked at it, like the first thing that I heard was graphics. Like, wow, these are really cool graphics. But the thing that really caught my attention was, and they did try to emphasize on this so that you might have caught it, was their asset pipeline here. The idea that you can take like these raw ZBrush sculpts and just dump them into the engine, where you can take a photogrammetry asset that you literally just pulled out of your camera and just dump that right into Unreal. And this is the sort of thing that I really like. These asset pipeline improvements basically cut out huge swaths of work. Like if you don't have to do retopology or this like normal map baking or anything like that, then you've cut out hours of work on, or days of work, depending on what exactly you're trying to do there. These are the sort of tools that really make a big difference when you're trying to create something. It's not about how good it looks, it's about how long it takes you to get something to look good or to your bar of quality. So like that's something I've had in my mind, and I'm super glad that Unreal is focusing on this, because this is super important. So this is also something that I've focused with StereoKit. A lot of StereoKit is based around how do I do things without build steps. So like here's an example of loading an asset from file. This is just a model that I took off a Sketchfab, and like it's not compiled in any way. It's not part of my project. This is literally just a GLTF file that's in the file system, and I've browsed to it and said open. This ends up being one line of code in StereoKit, and this is super important for just being able to do these things quickly. Like I don't have to worry about it. Like I just pull it from the file system. And like if you're used to a game engine, it's usually not that simple. Like you have to import it into your project. It has to compile it into its internal format. There's all sorts of import options that you need to figure out. It's a process that takes a lot of time. And even more than that, you can't do it at runtime. So if you want to swap out a model dynamically, like a user provides it to you, or you want to pull it from a server somewhere, you can't really do it with the built-in code paths, because it really needs those compile steps. So for StereoKit, I said, like, this is super important. I need to be able to load any old asset, optimize it internally, like in a background thread or something else. But it just needs to be able to go. It just needs to be a single line of code. It can't be a complicated process. This has to be fast. Similarly, and this is kind of an opinionated thing for the audience that I'm working with StereoKit, is the lighting for StereoKit is really, really basic. So you're not going to encounter light maps. You're not going to have baked global illumination. All that you have in StereoKit is a single spherical harmonics lookup. And since a lot of what I'm targeting for StereoKit is kind of like business mixed reality applications or tools or things like that, where it's not necessarily about the highest fidelity graphics, it's mostly about like, I just want to make an application. This is a really great thing because you don't have to think about lighting. You don't have to worry about like how many point lights before things start to lag, or like how many shadow cascades should I use for performance on a mobile device. Like none of that. This is just a single spherical harmonics lookup. And that is a little limiting, but it does mean that you don't have to compile your lighting. It does mean you don't have to think about your lighting. It just means that you consider lighting solved and just go with what you've got there. So that's my talk. So I just wanted to come back and say, like, you should definitely be considering tools as a core part of your workflow, because they absolutely change how you develop and the quality of work that you develop. Like, even if you don't think you need a tool, if you build a tool, you will probably find that you can't live without it. And this can be as basic as like maybe a small editor extension for managing your scenes a little bit more nicely, or a small editor extension for, I don't know, organizing your spawning waves or something. But these things, like this little bit of work that you can do, can really pay off in swaths later down the road. Again, a lot of this is kind of towards this idea of iteration time and fluency. Like, if you can increase your fluency with building something, or you can reduce the iteration time required to make something, both of these things allow you to either think in like a higher level of abstraction, or just allow you to pay attention to the more important details of what you're doing. So if you're interested in any of the things that I was talking about, you can chat with me more on Twitter. I'm Kojaku there. I occasionally blog about tech art, or productivity philosophy, or just tech in general, sometimes tutorials on playdeck.net. And if StereoKit is something that's interesting to you, since that's my major project right now, stereokit.net is where that resides. But thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions, I believe there's some chat windows over here. I'll stick around and answer some questions if you guys have them. So thank you. Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing anything popping up, so hopefully that was pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to log off, but thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.